My name is Emma Carter. Have you ever sat across from someone who once promised to love you in sickness and in health, only to realize that to them, love was nothing more than a lease agreement with an early termination clause? Grab a cup of coffee and sit with me for a moment, because if you've ever had to quietly rebuild your life from the absolute ashes, while the person who burned it down watched from a distance, then what I'm about to share is going to hit very close to home. Before we get into the details of how everything shattered and how it was ultimately put back together, do me a huge favor. If you believe that real strength isn't about how hard you can hit, but about how gracefully you can stand up when everything is working against you, type the word strength in the comments right now. It lets me know we're on this journey together. Let's start where the illusion finally cracked. It was a Tuesday morning in early spring, inside a county courtroom that felt entirely too cold. The air conditioning was humming a low, metallic tune overhead, a sound that seemed to vibrate straight into the old fractures in my left knee and my pelvis. If you have ever carried deep physical injuries, you know exactly what I mean. The cold has a way of reminding you of every single mistake, every trauma, and every piece of metal holding your frame together long before you even have a chance to open your mouth. I was sitting at the petitioner's table, gripping a single worn leather folder. Inside that folder weren't high-priced legal briefs or glossy presentations. It was just 9 years of absolute truth. 9 years of doctor receipts, school attendance records, parent-teacher conference notes, and small faded report cards. Across the room, separated by just a few yards of polished oak, sat my ex-husband, Julian. He looked exactly like the corporate success story he always wanted the world to believe he was. He was wearing a tailored navy suit that probably cost more than my first 3 used cars combined. His watch gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, and his hair was perfectly styled. Right behind him, sitting in the front row of the gallery with her arms tightly folded, was his new wife. The former coworker he had always insisted was just a colleague back when I was deployed. She was wearing pearls and the exact same smug, dismissive expression she had carried into the courtroom every single morning of this hearing. To them, I wasn't a mother fighting for her child. I was just an inconvenient roadblock, a broken veteran with a visible limp who didn't belong in their pristine, upwardly mobile world. For the past 2 days, Julian's high-priced attorney had done everything in his power to paint a picture of a woman who was fundamentally unhinged. They used words like physically limited, emotionally compromised, and unstable. They tried to turn my service, the very sacrifice that had broken my body, into a legal liability. They wanted the judge to believe that because I couldn't run a marathon, or because cold mornings made me steady myself against the wall, I was somehow unfit to raise my 9-year-old daughter, Maya. Julian sat there nodding along, looking perfectly relaxed, playing the part of the deeply concerned, benevolent father who had suddenly swooped in to rescue his daughter from a substandard life. But then, Judge Eleanor Watkins did something that wasn't in their pristine legal script. She stopped looking at their glossy binders. She bypassed the arguments, adjusted her reading glasses, and broke the physical wax seal on a protected, unredacted federal file that my attorney, Linda, had quietly submitted through a congressional liaison the day before. The sound of that thick paper tearing open was the loudest thing in the entire room. I watched Julian's face carefully. For a brief second, his posture didn't change, but his eyes tracked the movement of the judge's fingers. He didn't know what was in that file. He had spent 9 years assuming he knew everything about my injuries, because he had skimmed a few basic medical discharge summaries before walking out the door. He had simply never cared enough to look deeper. He didn't realize that some truths don't belong to the public record until they are absolutely forced into the light. And as the judge's eyes rested on the very first page, the smug look on Julian's face began to develop its very first crack. The courtroom grew so quiet you could hear the faint, high-pitched hum of the old fluorescent lights overhead. Julian shifted slightly in his chair. It was a subtle movement, just a tiny adjustment of his weight. But if you've spent years tracking the moods of a man who uses silence as a weapon, you learn to read the smallest changes in his body language. His high-priced attorney, Arthur Vance, was still standing confidently beside him, one hand casually resting on his expensive leather briefcase. Vance had spent the last 2 hours delivering a beautifully polished closing argument about my supposed physical limitations and combat-related emotional instability. He had woven a narrative that made Julian look like a savior and me look like a broken relic of a past deployment. But Judge Watkins wasn't listening to Vance anymore. Her eyes were fixed on the document in front of her. She slowly reached up, adjusted her reading glasses, and turned a page. Then she stopped. She didn't keep flipping through the file. Her gaze locked onto a single paragraph halfway down the page, and she stayed there for what felt like an eternity. The silence in the room stretched out, becoming heavy and suffocating. I looked over at Julian. The relaxed, confident posture he had maintained for 2 days was beginning to evaporate. The color was slowly draining from his face, starting at his jawline and moving upward, leaving his skin looking strangely gray under the courtroom lights. He looked like a man who had suddenly realized he had walked into a room with only one exit, and someone else held the key. "Mr. Vance!" Judge Watkins said calmly, her voice cutting through the silence like a scalpel. She didn't look up from the file. "When your client provided his initial disclosures regarding Mrs. Carter's military background, he submitted a standard Department of Defense medical discharge summary. Is that correct?" Vance cleared his throat, his confident demeanor faltering for just a fraction of a second. "Yes, Your Honor. We provided the complete medical records made available to the public and to my client during the divorce proceedings 9 years ago. They clearly outline the extent of the petitioner's physical trauma and subsequent retirement." "I see," Judge Watkins murmured, finally raising her eyes to look directly at Julian. Her expression was entirely unreadable, the face of a seasoned judge who had seen every trick, every lie, and every manipulation that human beings could conjure up in a family court. It appears, then, that this court has been given an incomplete picture, a highly selective, deeply unrepresentative picture. Julian swallowed hard. I saw his tie move against his throat. "No," he whispered, his voice barely rising above a breath. "No, that's not possible. I had everything. Her brother gave me the files." "Your client had what he chose to look at, Mr. Vance," Judge Watkins continued, her tone dropping into a cold, measured rhythm that made Vance straighten up uncomfortably. "What he did not have, or perhaps what he simply chose to ignore because it did not suit his narrative, is the official, unredacted operational evaluation from the Department of the Army, which was only fully declassified and verified through federal channels last month." Julian's new wife leaned forward in the gallery, her pearls clicking softly against the wooden bench. The smug expression she had worn like armor for days was completely gone, replaced by a sudden, sharp look of anxiety. She stared at the back of Julian's head, as if trying to force him to look back at her, but Julian couldn't move. He was staring at the folder on the judge's desk as if it were a live explosive. At that exact moment, looking at the tight line of his shoulders and the way his fingers were gripping the edge of the mahogany table, I realized something that sent a strange, quiet chill through my own chest. For the first time in nearly 10 years, Julian was afraid. He wasn't afraid of me. He wasn't afraid of my limp, or my cane, or the folder of elementary school report cards sitting in front of me. He was afraid of the truth. And the incredibly strange thing was, I had never once tried to hide it from him. I had never locked it away in a safe or sworn my family to secrecy. The truth had been right there, written into the fabric of my scars, the way I moved, and the quiet nights I spent staring at the ceiling. Julian had simply never cared enough to ask. He had been so consumed by his own exit strategy, so eager to harvest the pieces of our life that were useful to him while discarding the rest, that he never bothered to look at the woman he was leaving behind. He saw a broken partner, packed his bags, and assumed the story was over. He had no idea that the real story was only just beginning. To understand how we ended up in that frozen room, we have to look back 9 years. We have to go back to a gray Tuesday afternoon in late October, when a military medical transport plane touched down at Pope Army Airfield, just outside Fayetteville, North Carolina. If you've never experienced a military medical evacuation flight, it's hard to describe the atmosphere. It's not like a commercial flight where people are chatting, eager to see their families, or complaining about legroom. It is an aircraft filled with a heavy, collective exhaustion. It smells of antiseptic, old sweat, and stale operational gear. I barely remember the actual wheels hitting the tarmac. The high-dose pain medication the flight medics kept track of had blurred the edges of my reality into a hazy, dreamlike sequence. Every time the heavy plane dipped or shifted in the air, a sharp, white-hot ache would flare up through my shattered pelvis, shooting all the way down into my left knee. My leg was entirely encased in a rigid, heavy orthopedic brace that felt like an anchor, dragging me down into the canvas litter. Every deep breath I tried to take was cut short by the throbbing pain of 3 broken ribs on my left side. I remember pressing my forehead against the small, scratched window of the transport plane. After months overseas, surrounded by dust, concrete barrier walls, and the harsh, blinding heat of an operational environment, North Carolina looked impossibly green. It was a beautiful, deep green that made my throat tighten. But beneath the relief of seeing home, there was a profound, terrifying vulnerability. I wasn't coming back the way I had left. I wasn't the confident, physically invincible captain who had deployed a year prior. I was coming home in pieces, held together by titanium pins, fiberglass casts, and sheer willpower. Mostly, as I watched the runway lines blur past, I kept telling myself that none of the physical pain mattered. I was finally coming home to my husband, and more importantly, to my baby boy. Our son, Noah, was only 3 months old when I had to leave. I still carried the vivid sensory memory of kissing his tiny warm forehead in the early morning darkness before boarding the bus to the deployment processing center. It was supposed to be a short, routine structural rotation, a standard administrative and logistics assignment. Instead, everything changed in a matter of 12 seconds on a narrow supply route. Our convoy had been caught in a complex ambush while assisting with the humanitarian evacuation of a local clinic. When the first vehicle was hit, everything devolved into thick black smoke, deafening noise, and chaos. I don't consider myself a cinematic hero. I was simply an officer responsible for the people under my command. I remember the suffocating heat as I helped pull 2 young, dazed soldiers out of a burning light tactical vehicle. I remember the exact smell of melting rubber and electrical fire. And then I remember the secondary explosion that caught me from behind, throwing me several feet across the gravel road. When I woke up in the military hospital in Germany days later, the diagnosis was a laundry list of severe orthopedic trauma: a shattered pelvis, a severely compromised left knee joint, structural nerve damage, and fractured ribs. The military surgeons were honest with me from day one. They told me I would walk again, eventually. But it would require an agonizingly long, intensive period of rehabilitation. It would take months of daily, grinding physical therapy just to stand without assistance. But sitting on that transport plane as it taxied toward the terminal, I wasn't afraid of the hard work ahead. I genuinely believed that the heaviest burden was behind me. I believed that Julian and I would face the long road of recovery as a team. I thought about how he would hold me when I cried, how he would help me navigate the house, and how we would laugh together as we watched Noah take his own first steps while I relearned how to take mine. I believed in the vows we had taken on a sunny June afternoon 5 years prior. I believed that a family was a sanctuary where you were safe when the rest of the world broke you. I could not have been more profoundly, heartbreakingly wrong. If you've ever had someone look at you with flowers in their hand while their heart was already halfway out the door, then you know exactly how the next part feels. Julian met me at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center a few days after I arrived. He walked into the ward carrying a massive arrangement of seasonal flowers, lilies, roses, bright autumn colors. Looking back at it now, with the benefit of 9 years of perspective, I realize he didn't buy those flowers for me. He bought them because there were public affairs officers in the hallway. He bought them because people expected a young, handsome corporate husband to look a certain way when his soldier wife came back from a combat zone on a litter. He smiled perfectly for a couple of photographs taken by a family readiness volunteer. He sat on the edge of my mattress, gently holding my hand while the floor nurses watched with soft, sympathetic smiles. He even leaned down and kissed my forehead, whispering that everything was going to be fine. I remember lying back against the stiff hospital pillows, feeling a wave of absolute gratitude wash over me. I remember thinking how incredibly lucky I was to have a partner who saw past the heavy, rigid braces encasing my legs, past the pale, exhausted look on my face, and saw me. I had no idea that while I was counting my blessings, Julian was already counting his options. 2 days later, after the administrative processing was finalized and I was transferred to a specialized, long-term rehabilitation unit closer to our home station, Julian came into my new hospital room. This time, there were no public affairs officers in the corridor. There were no volunteers with cameras, and the door was firmly shut. He wasn't carrying flowers. Instead, tucked under his right arm was a thick, generic manila envelope. He didn't sit down on the edge of the bed this time. He didn't pull up the vinyl visitor's chair. He stood near the foot of my bed, his hands stuck deep into the pockets of his slacks, watching me with a strange, detached expression that made my stomach drop before he even spoke a word. He didn't ask how my morning physical therapy session had gone. He didn't ask if the nurses were managing my pain levels correctly. He didn't even ask if I needed a fresh cup of water. He simply took the manila envelope from under his arm and placed it flat on my white hospital blanket, right over my non-functional left leg. "I've already signed everything on my end," he said. His voice was completely flat, devoid of anger, devoid of sadness, devoid of any recognizable human emotion. It was the tone of a man delivering a routine quarterly logistics report to a corporate board. I frowned, looking down at the heavy paper resting on my blanket, then back up at his face. "What is this, Julian?" "The divorce papers," he said quietly. He didn't blink. He just stared at me, his jaw set in a rigid line. For a long, surreal moment, I honestly thought the high-dose nerve medication and the synthetic opioids were causing me to hallucinate. I thought my mind was playing a cruel, stress-induced trick on me. I let out a short, breathless laugh that immediately caught in my throat, sending a sharp reminder of pain through my broken ribs. "What, Julian, what are you talking about? Look at me. I'm still in a hospital bed." I know, he said, finally looking away from me, his eyes drifting toward the window that looked out over the parking lot. We have a 3-month-old baby boy. My voice cracked, the reality of the situation beginning to pierce through my medical haze like a cold blade. Noah is at your mother's house right now. I haven't even been able to hold him properly yet. I can't even stand up on my own 2 feet to use the restroom. I know all of that, Emma, he said, his voice rising just a fraction, a sudden edge of defensive irritation breaking through his calm facade. Then, he looked back at me and said the exact words that would remain burned into my memory for the next 9 years. But I didn't marry someone I'd have to spend the rest of my life taking care of. I signed up for a partner, not a lifelong recovery project. The room became symbols of absolute, suffocating silence. I searched his handsome, familiar face for even the smallest trace of remorse, a single flicker of guilt, or a tear in his eye. There wasn't a single one. He had spent the last 2 weeks analyzing the medical summaries, calculating the timeline of my rehabilitation, and realizing that my career, my body, and my immediate future were going to require work. And Julian didn't do work unless it directly benefited his own trajectory. "What about Noah?" I whispered, my hands starting to shake against the sheets. "I'll send the court-ordered child support every month," he replied, adjusting the cuff of his shirt. "You haven't even held him this week, Emma. Let's be honest with ourselves. With your injuries, with the wheelchair, with the braces. He'll be better off without all of this baggage around him." He gestured vaguely toward my orthopedic equipment, toward the IV poles, and finally, toward me. He didn't see a mother, a wife, or a human being who had survived a catastrophe. He just saw an accumulation of depreciated assets that were cluttering up his pristine view of the future. 3 days after I was officially discharged from the inpatient rehabilitation unit, my older brother, Michael, was the one who drove me home. Julian wasn't there. He hadn't offered to help lift me into the passenger seat of Michael's truck, and he hadn't offered to clear a path through the front door. As Michael carefully navigated the vehicle down our quiet, tree-lined street in Fayetteville, my chest tightened. I gripped the door handle with my right hand, trying to brace my pelvis against every small bump in the asphalt. I kept telling myself that as long as I was back in my own space, surrounded by my own things, I could find a way to breathe again. But when Michael opened the front door and pushed my wheelchair across the threshold, the sound that greeted us wasn't the warm, familiar echo of a family home. It was the hollow, flat sound of an empty warehouse. I sat frozen in the center of the living room, my eyes sweeping across the space. The room looked like it had been sliced cleanly in half with a scalpel. The sofa we had picked out together was gone, leaving behind deep, rectangular indentations in the beige carpet. The television stand was bare, its tangled wires left behind on the floor like dead vines. I rolled myself forward into the hallway, the small wheels of my chair clicking against the hardwood. I pushed open the door to the master bedroom. Julian's closet was completely empty. Not a single wire hanger remained. The dresser drawers were pulled out, left open like gaping mouths. He hadn't just taken his clothes. He had taken half of the family photographs, the wedding album, and even the small decorative rug my mother had gifted us when we moved in. The only thing waiting for me in the entire house was sitting on the granite kitchen counter. It was a neat professional stack of documents bound by a heavy blue paper clip. A formal letter from his attorney outlining a temporary custody schedule that practically stripped me of any meaningful input until a judge could review my medical files. Later that afternoon, while Michael was upstairs trying to assemble a temporary medical bed in the guest room so I wouldn't have to navigate the stairs, our across-the-street neighbor, a sweet older military spouse named Evelyn, quietly walked through the unlocked front door. She was carrying a warm ceramic casserole dish wrapped in a checkered tea towel. She stopped when she saw me sitting in my wheelchair in the bare living room. Her eyes dropped to my leg braces, then darted to the empty spaces on the walls where our pictures used to hang. She hesitated, her bottom lip trembling slightly before she spoke. "Oh, Emma," she whispered, setting the dish down on the kitchen counter near the attorney's folders. "I wasn't sure if anyone had called you yet. I didn't want to overstep my bounds, but—" "Called me about what, Evelyn?" I asked, my voice flat, my hands resting heavily on the armrests of my chair. "I saw Julian yesterday morning," she paused, her voice dropping into a pained, apologetic whisper. "He had a massive moving truck out here while you were still at the clinic. He was moving things into one of those brand new luxury condos downtown, near the riverfront." She hesitated, looking down at her own shoes. He wasn't alone, Emma. There was a young woman there with him. She was directing the movers, carrying some of your old patio cushions." She looked right at me and didn't even blink. A strange, numb sensation washed over my skin. If you've ever been severely betrayed, you know that sometimes the truth doesn't hit you like a sudden shock. It hits you like a confirmation of a nightmare you've been having for months. Somehow, in the deepest, most quiet part of my soul, I already knew. A week later, another military spouse from Julian's office confirmed the rest. She sent me a digital photograph she had taken at a restaurant downtown. The timestamp on the image was from 2 months before my deployment had even ended, back when I was still running operations in the dust, trying to keep 22 young soldiers alive. The photo showed Julian, laughing, holding hands across a candlelit table with the exact same woman Evelyn had seen at my house. The affair hadn't started because of my injuries. My shattered pelvis and broken knee hadn't driven him into the arms of another woman. My tragedy hadn't broken our marriage. It had simply made it incredibly convenient for him to stop pretending. He didn't leave because I was broken. He left because he was finished using me. If you have ever had to navigate a crisis while looking down into the eyes of a child who completely depends on you, then you know that a mother's mind doesn't have the luxury of grieving. It operates on pure, calculated survival. After Michael finished setting up my temporary room downstairs, every single morning started exactly the same way. The alarm would go off at 5 a.m. in the absolute dark, long before the rest of the neighborhood was awake. Before I could even think about moving, I had to take my morning dose of nerve medication, waiting 30 minutes for the white-hot sharpness in my pelvis to dull down into a manageable, heavy ache. Then came the daily, exhausting mechanics of learning how to transfer my body from the mattress into the wheelchair without dropping my son. Have you ever tried to lift a 20-pound squirming infant when your own ribs screams every time you take a deep breath? There were mornings I would sit on the edge of that bed, gripping the wooden nightstand until my knuckles turned completely white, praying to whatever power was listening that my left leg wouldn't collapse beneath me before I could secure Noah in his harness. I remember one specific Tuesday morning, about 2 months after the deployment ended. Noah had a terrible case of colic. He had been crying for 3 hours straight, his tiny face flushed red, his little fists clenched against his blanket. I was exhausted. My body felt like it was breaking apart at the seams, and as I tried to wheel myself through the narrow hallway of our townhouse, the frame of my chair caught on the molding, ripping a chunk of painted wood straight off the wall. I stopped. I sat there in the dark hallway, holding my crying baby against my shoulder, and for the first time since landing at the airfield, I let myself cry. I cried until my chest heaved, until the pain in my fractured ribs made me gasp for air. I felt so incredibly small. I wondered if Julian had been right. I wondered if I really was just baggage. A broken, defective human being who was going to drag her own child down into a life of limitation. That afternoon, my Veterans Affairs therapist, a seasoned woman named Dr. Evelyn Vance, who had spent decades working with amputees and wounded soldiers, looked at me across her office. She saw the dark circles under my eyes, the tight, strained lines around my mouth, and she didn't offer me standard platitudes. She didn't tell me everything happened for a reason. "Emma," she said, her voice dropping into a calm, steady rhythm that instantly cut through my internal noise. "What is it that actually frightens you the most right now? Don't give me the clinical answer. Give me the truth." I looked down at my hands, which were raw and calloused from gripping the rims of my wheelchair. "I'm terrified that Noah is going to grow up believing his father left because of me. I'm scared he'll look at my braces, my limp, and my limitations, and think that his mother was too broken to keep a family together." Dr. Vance leaned forward, placing her hands flat on her desk. She looked at me for a very long moment, ensuring her eyes held mine. "Listen to me very carefully, Captain. Children are incredibly resilient, but more importantly, they are observant. They don't grow up remembering the people who walked away from them. They spend their entire lives remembering the ones who stayed. Noah won't care that you couldn't run a sprint in the backyard. He will remember that when his world was uncertain, his mother was the steady anchor that never budged." If this hits home for you right now, do me a favor. Type the word "andcore" in the comments, because that single sentence became the foundation of everything I built over the next 9 years. It carried me through the darkest, loneliest nights, when the physical pain was so intense I had to sleep sitting completely upright in a living room chair because lying down felt like my pelvis was being forced apart. Every agonizing step I took during my grueling daily rehabilitation sessions stopped being about proving Julian wrong. It became a silent, unbreakable promise to my son. I had survived an actual ambush on a foreign supply route. I was not about to let a cowardly exit strategy dictate the future of my boy. Healing, I eventually learned, isn't something that happens in a dramatic, cinematic flash. It is measured in tiny horizons, victories so small that nobody else in the world would ever think to applaud them. The first time I managed to stand on my own 2 feet for 60 seconds without my hands shaking against the kitchen counter. The first morning I walked across our small living room using only a quad cane, my left leg dragging slightly but holding my weight. The first time I lifted Noah completely out of his crib without a sharp, white-hot scream flaring through my broken ribs. Nobody pins a medal on your chest for those moments. No one plays a fanfare when you manage to carry a laundry basket across a hallway without your knee buckling. But they are victories all the same, and I celebrated every single one of them in the quiet sanctuary of our home. By the time Noah turned 18 months old, the medical boards were finalized, and I was officially medically retired from active duty service. Handing over my active military identification card at the gate was a lot harder than I had ever anticipated. The uniform had been my skin since I was 22 years old. It was my identity, my community, and my proof that I was capable of handling the heaviest loads life could throw at me. Suddenly, I had to figure out who Emma Carter was, when she wasn't wearing boots and rank structure. Thankfully, one of my former commanding officers, Colonel Diane Foster, refused to let me simply fade into the background. She called me one afternoon while I was sitting on the floor trying to help Noah stack plastic blocks. "Emma," her sharp, no-nonsense voice came through the speaker, instantly making me sit up a little straighter. "I hear you've been sitting in that townhouse long enough to let the dust settle. I have an opening for a senior logistics director with the Department of Defense civilian contractor up in Raleigh. It needs someone who can organize a supply line in their sleep. I let out a soft laugh, adjusting the brace on my knee. Colonel, I'd love to, but I have an energetic toddler, a permanent limp, and I can't relocate away from my medical support system. I didn't ask you to move to the Pentagon, Emma, she said, her tone softening just a fraction. The position allows for hybrid work, the office is fully accessible, and your brain isn't broken even if your pelvis has some extra titanium in it. Stop making excuses and take the job. I accepted the offer the next day. The position wasn't glamorous. There were no promotions, no deployments, and no military honors, but it allowed me to use every ounce of the strategic planning skills I had spent a decade developing, all while ensuring I was home every single evening to make dinner for my son. Money was tight during those first couple of years. I ended up selling my large SUV to buy a reliable, dented used sedan that was easier for me to slide into. Our new rental townhouse wasn't fancy. The kitchen cabinets had a persistent squeak, the carpets were faded, and the backyard was barely large enough for a small swing set. But it was entirely ours, and more importantly, it was completely peaceful. Julian, true to his detached nature, faithfully paid the exact dollar amount of child support ordered by the state. He did it via automated bank transfers, never a dollar more, never a day late, treating it like a utility bill he wanted to keep out of delinquency. But beyond that financial transaction, he was a ghost. There were no birthday cards, no Christmas gifts, no awkward weekend phone calls, and no surprise visits. Sometimes months would melt into one another without Noah even mentioning his father's name. C4? When Noah finally became old enough to notice the empty spaces at our small kitchen table, I made a strict promise to myself. I would never poison his heart with my own bitterness. One evening, after his kindergarten graduation ceremony, he climbed up onto the couch beside me, clutching a small plastic diploma. "Mom?" he asked, his large brown eyes looking up at me with that remarkable, heartbreaking simplicity that only children possess. "How come my dad doesn't come to my school stuff? Does he not love me because your leg got hurt?" The question hit me harder than the secondary explosion on that dusty supply route. It felt like all the air had been violently sucked from my lungs. I reached out, pulling his small, warm body tightly into my arms, resting my chin against his hair so he couldn't see the sudden sting of tears in my eyes. "Noah, look at me," I said, tilting his face up so he could see my expression. "Listen to me very carefully. There is absolutely nothing wrong with you, and my leg has nothing to do with why your dad lives in another city. Sometimes grown-ups make very selfish decisions because they are confused about what matters. Your dad made different choices, but that is his story, not yours. You are loved every single second of every single day in this house." He nodded thoughtfully, his little fingers tracing the edge of the fabric on my knee brace before he went back to playing with his blocks. And as the years marched on, I watched my son grow into the kind of young man that every single mother dreams of raising. He held doors open for elderly neighbors. He thanked waitresses with genuine eye contact, and he possessed a quiet, steady empathy that mirrored the peace we had fought so hard to cultivate in our home. We had built a beautiful, slow-paced life out of the wreckage, and I truly believed the worst of the storm was behind us. I had no idea that Julian was watching our quiet progress from a distance, waiting for the exact moment our little horizon became valuable enough for him to try and steal it. As Noah turned 9 years old, he began to develop an absolute fascination with military history. He didn't care about modern video games or flashy toys. Instead, he devoured books about World War II, memorized the names of Medal of Honor recipients, and spent hours listening to my father read old tactical logs over video calls. He was growing into an exceptionally disciplined, grounded young man. And that discipline truly showed itself when his fourth-grade teacher nominated him for the Carolina Junior Leadership Academy. If you aren't familiar with it, it is an incredibly selective state program. A curriculum designed for high-achieving youth that includes academic scholarships, civic mentoring by retired officers, and a direct pipeline toward prestigious service academy recommendations. Only a handful of students across the entire state are accepted each year. Noah worked tirelessly on his application, writing essays late into the night at our kitchen table while I reviewed his grammar. When the thick acceptance envelope finally arrived in our mailbox, he burst through the front door, waving the paper over his head, his face absolutely radiant with pride. We danced around our small kitchen, laughing, celebrating yet another beautiful milestone built entirely from our own quiet labor. Neither of us realized that a mutual acquaintance had mentioned Noah's major achievement to Julian at a regional corporate networking event in Charlotte. You see, there is a very specific type of person in this world. And maybe you've encountered one in your own life, who possesses what I call a harvest mentality. These are the individuals who disappear entirely when the soil is hard, when the winter is freezing, and when the ground requires intense, back-breaking labor to cultivate. They don't want to help you dig the trenches. They don't want to water the seeds, and they certainly don't want to sit with you in the dark while you pray for rain. For rain. But the very moment the crop ripens, the exact second the flowers bloom and the harvest looks beautiful, prestigious, and valuable, they suddenly show up with a basket in their hand, demanding their share of the fruit. Julian hadn't changed one bit in 9 years. His corporate career had advanced exactly the way he wanted, but from what mutual friends occasionally let slip, his personal life was hollow. He had built a pristine, high-end image in a gated Charlotte community, driving luxury cars and posting manicured vacation photos with his new wife. But he lacked real substance. When he found out that his son, the boy he had dismissed as baggage that would drag down his lifestyle, was now tracking toward elite military academies and state-level recognition, Julian didn't see a son to congratulate. He saw an asset. He saw a highly reputable social trophy he could display to his corporate peers, a built-in legacy he could use to rewrite his own history. He wanted to be able to stand on the stage at the leadership banquets, pat Noah on the back in front of judges and civic leaders, and claim that his own superior genetics and background were the reason for the boy's success. He wanted to harvest the rewards of a child he had completely abandoned during the labor-intensive years. And because he had the financial capital to hire the most aggressive family law firm in the state, he decided that the easiest way to take the harvest was to simply erase the mother who had planted the seeds. The actual ambush didn't happen in a dark alley or on a dangerous road. It arrived on a rainy Thursday afternoon in a glossy, corporate-branded courier envelope. I was standing in my small kitchen, listening to the familiar, comforting whistle of the tea kettle on the stove, waiting for Noah to finish unpacking his school backpack upstairs. I sliced open the heavy paper seal with a butter knife, expecting it to be a standard insurance update or a routine contract renewal from my logistics job. Instead, the very first line of the legal document inside made my entire body go completely rigid. Petition for change of custody and modification of parental rights. Julian wasn't asking for a few extra weekends or a shared holiday schedule. He was asking the court for sole physical and legal custody of our son. He wanted to remove Noah from his school, his home, and his community, and relocate him permanently to his estate in Charlotte. And as my eyes raced down the page, taking in the cold, calculated legal terminology, a sickening wave of realization washed over me. This had absolutely nothing to do with genuine fatherhood or making up for 9 years of lost time. This was a clinical, corporate-style hostile takeover. They had meticulously spent months building a case against me, transforming my everyday life into a series of liabilities. The petition argued that because of my severe, combat-related orthopedic trauma, I was physically limited in my ability to protect and supervise an active, growing young man. It suggested that my steady, long-term participation in VA therapy was proof of ongoing emotional instability and psychological strain. They claimed that Julian's high-income, two-parent household and premium neighborhood would provide Noah with an exponentially higher standard of living and greater structural stability than a single, disabled mother working out of a rented townhouse. I stood there frozen by the kitchen counter, the papers trembling in my hands, while the kettle continued to whistle louder and louder until Noah's bedroom door opened upstairs. I quickly folded the thick documents, stuffing them deep into a lower drawer just as his footsteps came bounding down the stairs. "Everything okay, Mom?" he asked, sniffing the air. "Is the tea ready?" I forced the most natural, reassuring smile I could summon, my heart pounding violently against my ribs. "Everything is perfect, buddy. Just a few work emails. Why don't you wash your hands for dinner?" The next morning, I sat in a high-rise office downtown, facing Linda Brooks, a family law attorney who came highly recommended by a local veterans support network. Linda was a sharp, no-nonsense woman with silver hair and a calm, analytical gaze that instantly made me feel like I had an experienced commander standing beside me in the trenches. She spent 45 minutes reading through Julian's petition without saying a single word, her pen occasionally making tiny, precise marks in the margins. When she finally laid the papers down on her desk, she leaned back and sighed. "Emma, let's be entirely blunt about what we're looking at here," Linda said, her voice measured and steady. "This isn't a custody request. It's a strategic siege. They are banking on the fact that your medical files show real physical damage, and they are hoping to bait you into looking angry, volatile, or broken during the deposition process. They want to turn your sacrifice into a weapon." During the formal depositions 3 weeks later, Julian's attorney, Arthur Vance, tried exactly that strategy. He sat across from me in a sterile corporate conference room, leaning forward with a patronizing, overly sympathetic smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mrs. Carter," Vance said, tapping his pen against his yellow notepad, "you still walk with a significant visible limp, do you not? You require a cane on damp mornings?" "I do," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly level, my hands folded calmly on the table. "And if Noah were running into a busy street, or if there were an emergency in the home requiring rapid physical intervention, can you honestly tell this room that you could run to him? That your body wouldn't fail you?" I looked directly into his eyes, refusing to blink, refusing to let the hot flash of anger in my chest break through the calm mask I had spent 9 years perfecting. "Mr. Vance, if my son were in danger, my body would undoubtedly ache for weeks afterward. But I can assure you, with absolute certainty, I would still get to him first." Linda smiled quietly beside me, adjusting her notes. We had survived the initial skirmish, but I knew the real test would come inside the courtroom, where Julian's wealth and polished narrative would be on full display before a judge. They thought my physical scars were a map of my weakness. They had absolutely no idea that those very same scars were the blueprint of my resilience. The first day of the formal custody trial felt less like a family dispute and more like a high-stakes corporate tribunal. The county courtroom was bathed in the harsh, unflattering glow of fluorescent lights, and the air was thick with the scent of old paper, floor wax, and tension. Julian and his legal team took up almost the entire right side of the room. They had brought in presentation easels, glossy bound portfolios detailing his financial investments, color-coded diagrams of his estate in Charlotte, and printed brochures of the private preparatory school they had already chosen for Noah without my input. Julian sat tall, adjusting the cuffs of his pristine suit, projecting an aura of absolute financial invincibility. His new wife sat directly behind him, her fingers casually playing with her strand of pearls, her posture radiating a quiet, triumphant satisfaction. To them, the outcome of this hearing was already a foregone conclusion. They believed that in a world governed by wealth, a rented townhouse and a single mother with a physical disability couldn't possibly compete. When it was their turn to present, Arthur Vance took the center of the floor with the smooth, theatrical confidence of a man who was used to winning by overwhelming his opponents. For nearly an hour, he spun a highly articulate, devastating narrative. He walked the judge through my medical discharge summaries, highlighting the severity of my orthopedic trauma, the long history of my physical therapy, and my continued use of a cane on cold mornings. He didn't yell or show anger. Instead, he used a tone of deep, patronizing concern. "Your Honor," Vance said, gesturing broadly toward his glossy exhibits, "we do not dispute that Mrs. Carter is a dedicated individual, but the reality of her condition cannot be ignored. We are talking about a young boy entering his formative teenage years, a boy who needs an active, physically capable household. My client offers a premium, two-parent environment, unlimited educational resources, and a lifestyle that can fully support a rising leader. Mrs. Carter's home, while well-intentioned, is physically and financially limited by the tragic consequences of her past deployment." Julian then took the witness stand, smoothing his tie as he sat down. He looked directly at Judge Watkins, his voice carrying a practiced, warm resonance. "I've always loved my son," Julian said smoothly, leaning slightly toward the microphone. "I want nothing more than to give him the absolute best future possible, a future I don't believe his mother can physically provide, given the immense strain of her daily limitations." Linda Brooks stood up from our table. She didn't carry any glossy presentation boards or colored diagrams. She simply held a yellow legal pad and walked toward the witness stand with a slow, deliberate pace that instantly shifted the rhythm of the room. "Mr. Carter," Linda began, her voice calm and remarkably conversational, "you've spoken at length today about your deep desire to provide for Noah's future. Can you tell this court when you attended his last birthday party?" Julian hesitated, his eyes shifting briefly toward his attorney before he cleared his throat. I couldn't make it that weekend due to a critical corporate restructuring meeting in Atlanta. But I sent a very substantial financial gift." "I see," Linda noted quietly, making a small checkmark on her pad. "And when was the last time you attended a parent-teacher conference at his elementary school?" "My schedule makes traveling to Fayetteville during weekdays incredibly difficult," Julian said, his defensive irritation beginning to show through his smooth facade. "But as I said, I review his report cards when they are sent out." "Understood," Linda continued, stepping closer. "Then let's test your knowledge of his daily life. What is your son's absolute favorite academic subject?" Julian adjusted his position in the chair, a slight bead of sweat forming near his temple. "He's a very bright boy. I believe he excels in science, engineering." "It is history, Mr. Carter," Linda said flatly. "He reads biographies of Medal of Honor recipients for fun. Let's try another one. What size shoes does your 9-year-old son currently wear?" Silence hung over the witness stand for 5 long seconds. Julian stared at her, his mouth opening slightly, but no words came out. "What food is he severely allergic to?" Linda pressed, her voice dropping into a firmer, unyielding register. Julian looked completely panicked now, his eyes darting frantically toward Arthur Vance, who was sitting up straight, his confident posture rapidly dissolving. I don't recall the specific allergen off the top of my head. My mother usually handles those details when he visits. Thank you, Mr. Carter, Linda said, turning her back on him and returning to our table. No further questions. Julian stepped down from the stand, his face a strange shade of pale gray, the pristine illusion of his perfect fatherhood completely shattered by his own profound indifference. When Julian returned to his seat, the atmosphere on his side of the courtroom had completely shifted. The initial smug confidence was gone, replaced by a tense, hurried whispering between Arthur Vance and his client. But Linda didn't give them a moment to regroup. She stood up, smoothing the front of her blazer, and turned toward the bench. "Your Honor," Linda said, her voice echoing clearly in the quiet room. The petitioner has based their entire case on a highly selective, deeply incomplete presentation of my client's military background. They have introduced basic medical discharge, summaries to argue that her physical trauma renders her unfit. At this time, we call upon the court to review a document that has been officially verified and transmitted through federal channels. The unredacted, recently declassified operational evaluation file from the Department of the Army regarding Captain Emma Carter. Judge Watkins raised an eyebrow, adjusting her glasses. "Mr. Vance, has your client received a copy of this file in their initial disclosures?" Vance stood up, looking genuinely bewildered. "No, Your Honor. We were under the impression that we possessed the complete medical and administrative record. My client was never provided with any classified operational data during their divorce proceedings." "That is because it wasn't declassified until very recently, Mr. Vance," Linda countered smoothly, nodding to the court clerk. The clerk stepped forward, carrying a thick manila folder secured by a heavy, tamper-evident federal seal. The courtroom became so quiet that the crisp snap of the plastic seal breaking sounded like a pistol shot. Judge Watkins accepted the file without any theatrical pause or dramatic speech. She understood that in a court of law, verified facts carry infinitely more weight than polished rhetoric. She began to read. She turned the first few pages slowly. Service, history, decorations, performance evaluations from my time as a company commander. Julian sat perfectly upright, a forced, relaxed smile plastered on his face. I could tell what he was thinking. He believed the file would simply provide more granular detail about the severity of my injuries. He thought it would confirm his narrative that I was a broken project. He had absolutely no idea what else was documented in those pages. Judge Watkins stopped halfway through the folder. Her eyes locked onto a specific paragraph, and she stayed there for what felt like an eternity. The silence in the courtroom stretched tight, becoming heavy and suffocating. Then she looked up, her gaze bypassing the attorneys and resting directly on me. "Captain Carter," Judge Watkins said, her voice dropping into a low, respectful register. "Was this portion of your operational review classified under specialized security protocols until recently?" "Yes, Your Honor," I replied, standing steady beside my chair, my hands resting flat on the table. Because the incident involved ongoing humanitarian evacuation, logistics, and cross-border coordination, the full tactical evaluation was restricted until the mission profile was completely closed out. The judge nodded once, turning back to the file. "I see." She adjusted her glasses, looking over at Julian, whose forced smile was rapidly beginning to decay. "I am going to read a portion of this official federal evaluation into the record. Every person in this room needs to hear it." She cleared her throat and began to read in a calm, unhurried cadence. Despite sustaining multiple life-threatening injuries, including a fractured pelvis and severe blast trauma. During the secondary explosive ambush, Captain Emma Carter repeatedly refused medical evacuation. Under direct fire and with compromised mobility, she remained on the scene to coordinate the precise evacuation priorities for 22 personnel and a local civilian medical clinic. Military, psychological, and operational evaluations conducted during her recovery unanimously concluded that her decision-making under extreme, life-threatening duress remained exemplary. She demonstrated extraordinary judgment, emotional stability, and an unwavering devotion to those placed in her care. Absolute, deafening silence blanketed the courtroom. The words seemed to hang in the air like smoke. I closed my eyes for a single fraction of a second, feeling a sudden, deep ache in my chest. I hadn't heard those details read aloud since the day I sat before a medical review board. When I opened my eyes, Julian had gone completely, horrifyingly pale. His mouth was open slightly, his chest rising and falling in shallow, rapid breaths. "No," he whispered, his voice cracking as he stared across the room at me, his eyes wide, with a mixture of shock and sudden defensive terror. "No, that's not possible. The medical discharge just said permanent orthopedic degradation. It didn't say any of that." Judge Watkins leveled a cold, unyielding gaze directly at Julian. "Mr. Carter, it appears that while you were busy calculating the inconvenience of your wife's recovery, the United States Army was busy documenting the character of an extraordinary officer. This court is not in the habit of taking a child away from a mother whose judgment under fire has been rated as flawless by the highest military authorities in the country." Arthur Vance slowly sat back down, quietly removing his glasses and rubbing his forehead, a silent gesture of absolute surrender that spoke louder than any legal objection ever could. The legal foundation of Julian's case hadn't just cracked. It had completely turned to dust right before his eyes. But the hearing wasn't entirely over. Judge Watkins closed the heavy manila folder, setting it squarely in the center of her desk, and turned her attention toward the small conference room connected to the side of the courtroom. Throughout the grueling 2 days of arguments, Noah had remained in that room under the quiet, protective care of a court-appointed child advocate, keeping him entirely insulated from the toxic mud Julian's team had tried to throw. Judge Watkins pressed a button on her intercom, requesting the advocate to bring Noah into the main room. When the heavy wooden door pushed open and my 9-year-old son walked out, my heart skipped a beat. He looked so small in that large, formal room, wearing a neat button-down shirt we had picked out together at the local mall. He didn't look frightened. He looked calm, his steady brown eyes instantly finding mine and holding them with a quiet reassurance that made me sit up straighter. The judge smiled gently, her entire demeanor softening as she leaned forward over the high bench. "Hi, Noah. Thank you for being so patient with us today. I know this is a very strange, very loud place for a young man to spend his afternoon." "It's okay, ma'am," Noah said, his voice surprisingly clear, echoing slightly against the high ceilings. "Noah," Judge Watkins continued, her tone conversational and entirely non-threatening. "I've spent the last 2 days talking to a lot of lawyers, looking at a lot of paperwork and listening to your parents. But before I make any decisions about your future, I need to hear from you. Can you tell me a little bit about what your mom does when things get difficult at home?" Noah hesitated for just a moment, his fingers lightly tracing the seam of his trousers. He looked over at Julian, who was leaning forward, an anxious, desperate expression plastered across his face. Then Noah looked back at the judge. "My mom never quits, ma'am," Noah said simply, his voice carrying the absolute heartbreaking honesty that only a child possesses. Last winter, during a really heavy rainstorm, I fell out of the big oak tree in the park and hurt my arm badly. The ground was all muddy, and my mom's left leg was hurting her a lot because of the cold. But she didn't wait for an ambulance. She lifted me right up into her arms and carried me all the way to the car, even though I could hear her breathing really hard and I knew her knee was hurting. He stopped, taking a deep breath, his eyes shining with an immense protective pride. She always tells me that soldiers don't leave people behind when the road gets rough, and she never left me behind either. When it's dark and I can't sleep, she stays right by my bed until the morning comes. I love my dad, but my mom is the one who stays. I felt a single, warm tear slip down my cheek, but I didn't wipe it away. I didn't feel embarrassed or weak. Every single exhausting therapy session, every lonely milestone, every cold morning where I had to force my body to stand up through pure agony. It had all led to this exact beautiful moment. Judge Watkins quietly removed her reading glasses, setting them down on her legal pad. When she looked back up at Julian, the warmth was completely gone from her expression, replaced by a cold, unmistakable disappointment that seemed to freeze the right side of the room. "Mr. Carter," the judge said, her voice dropping into a measured, unyielding rhythm. "There is a profound, fundamental difference between suddenly becoming interested in a child because they have achieved something reputable and actually doing the daily, invisible labor of becoming a parent. You cannot voluntarily remove yourself from the soil during the freezing winter years and then show up with a basket, expecting to harvest the rewards when the crop turns out beautiful. This court finds absolutely no merit to your petition. The request for a change of custody is denied with prejudice." Julian dropped his head into his hands, his broad shoulders collapsing inward, entirely defeated by the weight of a truth he had tried so hard to rewrite. When the judge's mallet finally struck the wooden block, signaling the official end of the hearing, the sound echoed through the room like a closing door. There were no reporters waiting outside the double doors. There were no flashing television cameras or dramatic crowds. It was just a quiet, ordinary afternoon in early spring, with the soft sunshine filtering through the tall windows of the courthouse corridor. And that was exactly how I preferred it. True victories don't need a public grandstand. They live in the quiet spaces where you can finally let your shoulders drop and take a full, unrestricted breath. Michael met us in the hallway, stepping forward and wrapping both Noah and me in a massive, tight hug that instantly made all the lingering tension in my lower back melt away. "I told you," Michael whispered into my hair, his voice thick with a fierce, quiet emotion. "I told you no one was ever going to take that boy away from you." "You did," I laughed softly, wiping a final trace of moisture from my eye. "You did, Michael. Thank you." As we walked down the wide granite steps of the courthouse, the spring air felt remarkably warm against my face. I adjusted my grip on my cane, taking each step with a slow, deliberate rhythm. Noah was walking right beside me, holding my free hand tightly, chatting happily about a history book he wanted to check out from the library on our way home. But before we could reach the bottom layout of the steps, I heard a familiar set of footsteps behind us. I stopped and turned around. Julian was standing a few feet away, near the heavy brass handrail. He looked completely different than he had 2 days ago. He looked older, not because of any gray hair, but because the polished artificial armor he had worn for 9 years had been completely stripped away, leaving behind a man who finally had to look at his own reflection in the mirror. His new wife remained far back near the glass entrance doors, looking away, refusing to come any closer. For the first time in nearly a decade, Julian looked directly into my eyes without any smugness, without any corporate superiority, and without any hidden agenda. "Emma," he said, his voice dropping into a low, uncertain murmur, I owe you an apology. A real one." I stood steady on my cane, watching him calmly. "I'm listening, Julian." "I should have been there." His voice cracked slightly, his eyes drifting down to my knee brace before rising back to my face. "I was selfish. When I looked at you in that hospital room, I was terrified of the work. I convinced myself that leaving was the easier path for everyone, that it was the best thing for me. I kept telling myself that I'd have plenty of time to be a father later." When things settled down, he let out a short, hollow laugh. I didn't realize how fast 9 years could disappear. There wasn't much left to say to him. No apology, no matter how sincere or broken, could return Noah's first steps. His first lost tooth, his first day of kindergarten, or the long, dark nights I spent rocking him through the worst of his colic. Those moments belonged entirely to the past, a past that we had survived without him. "I know I can't change what I did," Julian continued quietly, his hands stuck deep in his pockets. "But I'd really like the chance to try and become a better father now. If you'll let me." I didn't answer right away. I looked down at Noah, who was standing quietly by my side, listening to every single word. This wasn't my decision to make alone anymore. My son was old enough to have his own voice, his own boundaries, and his own heart. I knelt down on the stone step, ignoring the sharp protest from my left knee, bringing myself eye to eye with him. "You heard what your dad said, buddy," I whispered gently. "What do you think?" Noah thought about it for a long moment, much longer than most adults would have. He looked at his father, his expression remarkably calm and insightful. "You hurt my mom a lot," Noah said to Julian, his voice steady. "And you hurt me too, by not being there." Julian closed his eyes, a heavy tear escaping down his cheek. "I know, Noah, I know I did." Noah looked back at me, then back at his father. "But my mom always teaches me that forgiveness isn't something people have to earn from you. It's something you choose to give so your own heart stays soft. I'd like to get to know you, Dad. But we have to go very slowly." Julian nodded immediately, a wave of absolute relief washing across his face. "As slowly as you need, son. Whatever you want." That courtroom day wasn't the beginning of a perfect cinematic family. Those only exist in movies and glossy social media feeds. But it was the beginning of an honest one. Over the next year, Julian actually showed up. He didn't do it perfectly. Sometimes he was incredibly awkward. Sometimes he was uncertain, and sometimes the old corporate distance would creep back in. But he was consistent. He attended the counselor-guided family sessions, he respected our boundaries, and he even began volunteering his corporate logistical skills with a local nonprofit that retrofitted homes for wounded veterans. One quiet afternoon, while he was dropping Noah back off at our townhouse after a weekend visit, he stopped near the front porch and looked at me. "When the judge read your operational evaluation into the record that day," Julian said softly, "I realized something terrible, Emma. I had spent 9 years telling myself and everyone else that you were the one who was broken, just so I wouldn't have to face my own weakness. But the truth was, I was the one who ran because I was too broken to stay." I didn't answer him. I didn't need to. Life had already provided the answers for us. Today, Noah is preparing for his very first year of college. He still wants to serve others, whether that means wearing a uniform or entering a civilian profession. And that is entirely his choice to make. When I look at him now, I don't feel any lingering bitterness about the road we had to travel to get here. I am simply profoundly proud that he grew into a deeply compassionate, resilient young man. He didn't achieve that because his life was easy. He achieved it because hardship never had the power to harden his heart. Looking back now from the comfort of our quiet, peaceful horizon, I understand something I couldn't have possibly known 9 years ago. The greatest victory of my life wasn't winning that custody battle. It wasn't proving Julian wrong in front of a room full of expensive lawyers. It wasn't even hearing the extraordinary details of my military record read aloud into a permanent legal record. The greatest victory was raising a child who learned that true strength is never measured by rank, by wealth, by medals, or by revenge. It is measured entirely by character. If this story has touched your heart today, I hope you'll carry one simple truth with you as you move forward into your own life. The people who choose to stay with you through the absolute hardest, most unglamorous battles are the ones who shape your soul far more than the ones who choose to walk away. If you have ever witnessed that kind of quiet, unbreakable courage in yourself or in someone you love, thank you so much for sitting with me today and listening. And if you'd like to hear more honest stories about resilience, family boundaries, and genuine second chances, I would be absolutely honored if you shared this story, dropped a comment below, or joined me here again next time. Until then, keep your anchor steady, take care of your heart, and remember that you are always stronger than the storm.